to use your imagination. Since my lecture, my talk, is focused around a group of about 20 illustrations, then I'd like occasionally for you to think that the illustrations are actually here. It's an exercise in technology going wrong. It used to be that you could hear a lecture without illustration, without PowerPoints, and you could be absorbed by it. That's less and less the case. This is like asking kids who are watching TV every day and telling them that the electricity is off. But relying on you, on your patience and your goodwill. And I'll start from making a huge statement. I call this talk an incredible relationship, an unusual relationship, an unprecedented relationship. It's about one community of faith viewing another community of faith as essential for the advancement of history, as essential for the, not just advancements of history, but for God's plan and purposes in the ages to reveal, for the apocalyptic moment and for the Messianic times to unfold. It's unheard of. If you know of another such example in which a large, vibrant, major, influential community of faith, global, its hub is in America, viewing another people, a minority people, as the chosen people, quote unquote, not themselves, although in some ways themselves too, but another community, and putting a huge premium on the history of that people, on the role of that people in history, on particularly the role of that people in bringing about the Messianic times, then call me, even collect from wherever you are around the globe, wake me up in any hour. There is therefore something very unusual, that's not part of the regular relationship between communities of faith, between ethnic, religious communities. And this creates, I think this is what builds a whole series of situations that are in some ways almost surreal. They're in some ways outside the regular experience of communities and their relations to each other. In some ways, you can say that the evangelical relation to the Jews is revolutionary. Not in the sense that we didn't hear that before. There were groups already with the Radical Reformation that were saying similar things. I see there's an expert here on the history of the apocalypse and Messianic ideas in Christianity that is nodding. In some ways, we've seen that with the pietists in Europe in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. But we've seen that a little bit with the Puritans in England and New England, in the mostly starting in the late 16th century, turn of the 17th century, and throughout the 17th century. And we would see that again big time with the rise of evangelicalism in the English-speaking world at the turn of the 19th century. A new understanding of the Jews as heirs and continuers of historical biblical Israel. This sounds to many people, well, isn't that the case? Because that's the way Jews view themselves. But for 18 centuries, mainline Christianity was denying that role to the Jews and making the claim that the historical role of the Jews has come to an end. And the church, the body of Christians, of Christian believers, is real Israel, verus Israel, and has inherited God's promises to Israel. What Pietists and Evangelicals Jews do, they're going back to the early, they're reversing historical Christian views and saying, no, we actually recognize the Jews to be historical Israel. At the same time that it's revolutionary, it's also traditional. That is, the understanding has remained that the Jews won't come into their own as individuals and as a community unless and until they accept Jesus as their Savior. that Judaism on its own cannot offer its adherents moral compass, means towards salvation, eternal life. Jews need to accept Jesus as individuals, and the Jews as a community can be redeemed as a nation and go back to their historical role as God's first nation and restore David's ancient kingdom only when they accept Jesus. So on the one hand, we see an unusual relationship that will bring about scenes that we don't see usually in relationship between communities of faith. And on the other hand, we will also see a very complex relationship that at times seems as if it contains self-contradiction. But if you study the theology of evangelical Christians, you see that there's actually consistency and there is an inner logic to it. Now, the image that you don't see here was the image of John Hagee, very known, ubiquitous today, John Hagee, head of CUFI, Christian United for Israel, and I was actually going to point to that image, trying to be controversial, catch your attention. So think the image is there. It's a big round face, very self-satisfied. Big round face, very much of the rich uncle coming on a visit, and perhaps if you behave, he'll finance your college studies. So that very same John Hagee and Kufi, I wanted to point to it and said, you think this is now evangelical Christians and the Jews? It's not. He is a latecomer into the scene. He's a minor player. There's a long history. There have been hundreds of evangelical leaders. There are dozens of evangelical leaders that play a similar or a bigger role. And it's so much larger and richer than just John Hagee and Kufi. But I don't have the image, so I can't do that, really. I cannot really point and say that. I'm talking about long roots. Some of them I mentioned. Contemporary evangelicalism builds on the Puritan tradition, on the Pietist tradition, both of which recognize the Jews to be, or large parts of which recognize the Jews to be historical Israel. It also builds on the American revival tradition. Evangelicalism is formed in the late 18th century, around the rise of Methodism, the revivalist movement, building also on Pietist influences. Pietism is this minority movement in the center and north of Europe that has very similar ideas, including a huge emphasis, particularly in the case of Pietism, on the Messianic faith and on the need to evangelize globally. The first systematic missionaries among the Protestants are the Pietists, and they're the first to establish missions to the Jews, to start a whole new genre of literature for and about the Jews, and to study the Jews and build relationship with them on a systematic basis. So evangelicals build on that. Early 19th century see the beginnings of a huge movement of interest in the English-speaking world in Jews, and until the 1970s, the major means for evangelicals to show their interest in Jews, their concern for Jews, their involvement with the Jews, their wish to educate the Jews as to their real mission in history, because the Jews don't understand what they are about. Many Jews, incidentally, are really disappointing. They think that they're just regular people who can go around living their lives and running their businesses as if nothing special is there. We need to teach them better. Missions to the Jews, that's an opportunity to make a provocative statement. Missions to the Jews, which are very extensive, have been very extensive since the 18th century, in the English-speaking world since the 19th century. In relative terms, more than towards any other nation of Baptists and evangelicals. Missions to the Jews are not about converting individual Jews. Yes, it would be nice. Converting individual Jews means that the Jews are redeemable. Missions to the Jews are about educating the Jews as to their role and purpose in history. Teaching them what it means to be Jews, teaching them also about Jesus and the fact that there is no other venue for them to redeem themselves as people without Jesus, but also to prepare them for the end times and for the apocalyptic times. You might have heard about the 144,000 Jews who are supposed to convert instantly following the rapture, the snatching from earth of the truly converted Christians. How will Jews convert instantly if they're not taught what to expect? If they didn't even hear the message, the Christian message. So the Christian message needs to be taught to Jews in every generation so that they will, if they don't accept it now, they will accept it later on when the great events of the end times take place. Now, let's move to the American scene mostly. I can point to the British scene, but I think it would be more interesting for us, the American scene. Following the Civil War, the decades of the late 19th century, early 20th century, we get the rise of a conservative evangelical movement in America that would be known for quite a number of decades as fundamentalism, Protestant conservative movement that rejects and resents the liberal Protestant infatuation with the idea of progress, that rejects the liberal modernist academic study by Protestants of the Christian sacred scriptures, and that resents and rejects the post-millennial, progressive millennial view that humans can, on their own, improve society and gradually build the kingdom of God on earth. The conservatives are adopting a messianic faith, a premillennialist messianic faith, which means a faith in the coming of Jesus to redeem humanity and build the kingdom of God on earth. Before this kingdom can be ushered in, not through human endeavor, not through human effort, cooperation, education, but through divine intervention. And not all American evangelicals, but many, especially among the more conservatives, especially among the missionaries and among evangelists, are adopting a premillennialist, dispensationalist faith, which just was crystallized in Britain in the 1820s, 1830s, reaches America a few decades later, and becomes the philosophy of history of conservative American evangelicals. That's how they interpret history, view history, and see its beginnings and its moving towards the apocalypse. Dispensationalism comes from the idea that history is divided into eras, in each of which God has a different plan for humanity. And it has a different plan for a number of categories. The non-converted, the truly converted, and the Jews as a special category. The Jews are not just Koreans or Greek or Swedes. If you're unconverted, for those people there is the converted and the non-converted. Those who accepted Jesus as the personal Savior, those who have not. Those who have joined those who have adopted evangelical premises, those who don't. The Jews are a special category. There's a full awareness that most Jews in this generation will not convert. That most Jews will not convert until the end times. Which, as I mentioned, is no reason not to be involved in missions to the Jews. On the contrary. But there's also, since the late 19th century, interest in seeing the national rejuvenation of the Jews and the Jews going back to Palestine, quote unquote, in unbelief, without having accepted Jesus, building a commonwealth there. Believe it or not, all of that was prophesied, if you will, or predicted by evangelical Christians before the rise of political Zionism. I can point to a series of books. Again, something that would have appeared here is 1878. We get a booklet that will grow more and more along the way, because there will be a few additions. It's called Jesus is Coming, by which the author, William Blackstone, meant Jesus is coming again soon. And this is both a tool of evangelism, calling upon people to be born again in Christ, but it's also a tool of biblical, trying to educate people to accept a certain school of biblical exegesis and philosophy of history. To accept a certain critique of culture, if you will, and to accept the central role of Jews in history and in bringing about the Messianic times. And the author, wealthy businessman from Chicago, is well aware that this is a tough sell, that most American Protestants of the time don't see a reason to rejoice around the Jews, or to turn the Jews into a focal point of Messianic hopes. And so there's a call, there's a tying up of a certain reading of the Bible, which claims to be literal, and is as much, and is certainly more literal than the sophisticated academic higher criticism of the Bible. And the author says, have you not read the Bible? What does it say? So there's sort of a package deal that evangelists are trying to sell. Be born again in Christ. Be committed to reading the Bible as your guidance to living a Christian life, as God's message to humanity, where you can find history, you can find God's plans for humanity, where you can see that prophecies speak about a restored Davidic kingdom with the real children of Israel, which are identical with contemporary Jews. The same Blackstone is very important for us because he is the first American evangelist. There were a few Britishers before him, but he's the first American evangelist to actively try to organize a mass immigration of Jews to Palestine, and is trying to organize an international conference that will give Palestine back to the Jews. This is 1878 and 1886, second edition. This is exactly the time of the Berlin Congresses that take away Turkish territory, such as Bulgaria, and create a Bulgarian state. And he's saying, why can't we do the same with Palestine? And he has devised a concept that has become part of the evangelical point of view, evangelical premillennialist point of view, ever since. Now I'm pointing into John Hagee and saying, you see, he is holding the torch, following an evangelical American tradition in relation to the Jews. Because Hagee holds the same view. The view is that America has a role in history. It's a special country. It's the least, is not rejoicing, is not celebrating contemporary American culture. Evangelical thinkers, leaders never do. They always mourn the low morality of the age, and our culture has gone astray, and there's so many sexual indiscretions. There are always sexual indiscretions, and there's always bad morality all over the place. And we can find many signs to it in every generation. But the United States is still a more religious and moral nation than any other nation. That's the evangelical understanding. In relation to the Jews. And it has a special call in history to help restore the Jews to Palestine, to protect the Jews. America is then interwoven into an evangelical global worldview. Evangelical Christians are not Jehovah's Witnesses. They are American patriots. They are loyal to the American Commonwealth. And in some ways they have created a theology, but they're not Mormons, on the other hand, who make the claims America is the promised land. Americans are Israel. They make the claim that America has a role in history to protect Israel, which is something to pay attention to, and we'll talk about the historical development of that. But Blackstone is trying time and time again to call upon the rulers of the world, of his generation, to restore Palestine to the Jews. He's using the claim of the events, not the claim, but the events of pogroms, massacres of Jews in Russia in the 1880s, 1890s, as a means to promote awareness to Jewish suffering, and the solution is mass immigration to Palestine and the building of a Jewish Commonwealth there. When Herzl convenes the first Zionist Congress in 1897, he has evangelical Christians in the audience. That's a chapter of Zionism that most historians wished to neglect. He has evangelicals as his advisors. One of them, William Heschler, is a British, South African, German evangelical pietist with excellent connection in the Prussian German Royal Imperial House, and he is becoming Herzl's liaison as far as connections with Protestant rulers and statespersons are concerned. He's trying to bring the Emperor of Germany to become a patron of the Zionist endeavor. 1916-17, there's already a vital, small but vital Zionist federation in America, headed since 1916-17 by Louis Brandeis, first Jewish Supreme Court Justice, and a close associate of Woodrow Wilson. And the Zionist leadership, for the first time in America, is cooperating with Blackstone and is working in tandem with Blackstone to promote again the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine, a Jewish Commonwealth. Historians are well aware of the Balfour Declaration in 1917, in which the British government has declared that it will work towards the building of a Jewish Commonwealth. It sees favorably the building of a Jewish Commonwealth in Palestine. What is not known is that the British waited for an entire year until the Americans were willing to approve and allow them to issue the declaration. And that Blackstone, working, as I said, together with Zionist leaders of Stephen Wise and Louis Brandeis, has not only presented the president with a petition, not officially, signed by dozens of prominent American Protestants, and non-Protestants too at times, but that he has managed to bring his own church, the president's own church, Presbyterian Church USA, to endorse the petition, that he brought a whole series of churches in California, including the Methodists and Baptists, to endorse the petition. And that both Jewish Zionists and Christian Zionists were working behind the scene to convert Woodrow Wilson into a supporter of Zionism, something that he became just at that time. He would reveal his sympathy to Zionism openly in the conference in Versailles in 1919. In 1925, we get the scope strike, and we get, to a certain extent, to a large extent, the removal of conservative evangelicals, at that time known as fundamentalists, many of whom were what we call today Christian Zionists, missionaries to the Jews. We can go one by one, or the leaders of, and editors and writers of the fundamentals. Many of those people are moving away from the American political arena. They are continuing their work in education, in missions. They are even perhaps enlarging their conservative infrastructure, but they're not politically involved. When the deliberation that would lead to the UN decision to partition Palestine in November 1947, and would bring the American government to be the first to recognize the State of Israel following May 1948, evangelicals were supportive of Zionism, but they were rather passive. You would be surprised that at that particular moment, liberal Protestants, some liberal Protestants, were much more active. You can state names such as Reinhard Niebuhr, Paul Tillich, two of the leading theologians of the time, Protestant theologians of the time, who were members of the pro-Palestine, that time pro-Palestine means pro-Zionist, the pro-Palestine committee, and were promoting a pro-Zionist stand. Evangelicals will become involved with Israel big time following 1967. Why 1967, not 48? For a number of reasons. By 1967, the evangelical community is stronger, more politically involved. Following 1967, late 60s, 70s, then 80s, more politically involved, more self-assured, more assertive. June 1967, the so-called Six-Day War, would serve as a proof, a sign, that Israel was indeed born for a purpose, for a historical purpose. Israel has overtaken the historical parts of Jerusalem, including the Temple Mount. We'll see that that is particularly significant. Israel overcame 3 Arab nations in 6 days. Actually, it was fighting 3 days on every front. And forgive me for saying that in an auditorium of a respectable synagogue, beat the shit out of 3 Arab armies. This couldn't be a coincidence. Now, Israelis too, and many Jews, viewed the matter in messianic terms, mostly secular messianic terms. There's a validation of the Zionist Israeli experience. You know, as a validation of God's nod to Israel, the Jews, in a generation after the Holocaust, that won't happen again. Because before the war, there was real worry. The understanding was actually those armies will invade Israel, and if Israel survives, it would be after a bloody, long battle. But something else happened, and which has to do with the American nature of evangelicals, and particularly in America, but not only in America. Israel succeeded in overcoming 2 armies, Syria and Egypt, that were sponsored by the Soviets. The evangelical alliance with Israel started under the shadow of the Cold War. And with the understanding that by supporting Israel, the evangelicals are both following biblical a certain reading, or so I would say biblical reading of world events from their perspective. They are committed evangelicals, they are committed premillennialist Christians, but they're also committed Americans, because American interests lie with Israel, an opponent of the Soviet bloc, that is a stronghold, if you will, of American Western interests in the Middle East. I see that the idea that we will have here any illustration has been totally abandoned. And I'd like you to remember that, because you see, it doesn't take Jews more than an hour to lose hope. But the Messianic faith, the evangelical Messianic faith in America has been alive and well at the center, not encompassing all evangelicals, but at the center of conservative evangelicalism now for over 120 years, with events in the life of the Jewish people serving as proofs, as signs of the time, that history is on the side of evangelicals, and that they have read the Bible correctly, and that, yes, they understood the course of history better than the liberals. Nobody took Zionism seriously at the beginning. They took Zionism seriously before it even came on the scene. Nobody thought that the Jews would immigrate en masse to Palestine. They have emigrated en masse to Palestine. They have rejuvenized the Hebrew language. They have built a commonwealth there. They have taken over the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. They are Orthodox Jews nowadays. I'm talking about 1970s, 80s, since 70s and 80s. And there are groups of Orthodox Jews preparing for the temple sacrifices, preparing to build the temple, preparing to fulfill the various priestly functions in the temple. What could be a better proof than that? And here we reach what I would call a real surreal element in the evangelical Jewish enchantment. On the one hand, it has lasted through a long historical period. It has, in some ways, became warmer and friendlier than ever before. We'll talk about that a little bit. There's today a relationship between the leadership of Israel. Since 1977, the Likud coming to power and Begin becoming prime minister, there is a systematic relationship between Israeli leadership and evangelical leadership. The picture I wanted to show you of John Hagee, who is the other very, very powerful, shining, self-satisfied figure there, if not Benjamin Netanyahu? I hope I'm not hurting anybody's feelings. In case I don't sound as enthusiastic towards and appreciative towards Netanyahu as you would wish me to be. On the other hand, this friendship is more sectarian. When Brandeis, the conservative, evangelical, evangelist, premillennialist from Chicago, was befriending Zionist leaders, he was befriending the progressives of the progressives. Stephen Wise, from the Free Synagogue in New York, Louis Brandeis, one of the two progressive voices in the Supreme Court at the time. Today, the friendship is mostly between conservative evangelical leaders, who are usually hardline Republicans on the one hand, and Likud and its national religious allies on the other hand. Amazingly, unbelievably, unexpectedly, the friends of conservative evangelicals in Israeli society, those who appreciate their efforts, are on the right side of the political spectrum and are usually Orthodox nationalists, what I would call the settlers movement. 1989, the Settlers Journal, to give you one example out of many, called Nekuda, published an article about Christian Zionists, evangelical supporters of Israel. There's a whole, Kufi is just one group out of many. The largest group, one of the largest groups is actually the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem, which musters global evangelical support for Israel. And they're talking about the embassy. And they call the article, "Without Inhibitions, Christian Supporters of Jewish Settlements in Judea and Samaria." Why without inhibitions? Who has inhibitions? Well, I don't know the people there exactly, but I wouldn't be surprised if you are among the people who have inhibitions. The damn liberals. The progressive Jews. Quote-unquote left-wing Jews, those who are blind to the unfolding of prophecy. We see here some mutual reading of the biblical narrative, although, of course, a very different reading at the same time. The first stages of the Messianic timetable, both sides are welcome. Who the Messiah is a different story. And has he come for the first time or the second time, that's also a different story. But what's not contestable is that evangelical groups have, in the last generation, provided money and political support to right-wing Israeli groups who are into settling Judea and Samaria and are preparing towards the building of the temple. Pat Robertson, charismatic Christian, founding director of the 700 Club and the Christian Broadcasting Service, has invited Gershom Solomon, the founder and director of the first Temple Builders Group, Ne'emanei Har HaBayit, Temple Mount Faithful, now it's called the Temple Mount and Eretz Israel Faithful, invited him to talk on the 700 Club, offered him a vehicle, a voice, to collect money. And we have, of course, the speech, among other things, is that Robertson is introducing him as a person who is fulfilling a role and mission in history. And Solomon, on his part, is declaring that he is not just working on his behalf, on behalf of the Jewish people, but he is working on behalf of the entire Western tradition, Western world. Mutual project. Groups, the Temple Museum, which houses utensils, artifacts, utensils to be used when the temple is reestablished, it's in the Jewish quarter in Jerusalem, receives its funding from Christian supporters. Are they interested in the temple? And in what way are they interested in it? They want to see the temple rebuilt because that's the next stage in the Jewish Commonwealth, preparing the ground for the arrival of the Lord. The temple is supposed to be rebuilt actually after the rapture and under the auspices of Antichrist. Antichrist is a very interesting gentleman. None of you have met him yet, because he hasn't yet arrived or declared himself, but he's around. Antichrist, in Protestant tradition, until the 19th century, was very often the Pope. In premillennialist dispensationalist understanding, he's Jewish. One of, wanted Antichrist, bachelor's degree at least, etc. When you provide, you're asking for credentials, one of them, he needs to be Jewish because imposing as much as possible, he's an imposter, pretends to be the Christ, who will be recognized for a while by most people, or some people as the Christ. He needs to be Jewish because Jesus was a Jew, is a Jew. Not was, is. But something very interesting has happened. And the temple is very much an Antichrist project. But something very interesting has happened. Evangelical activists and Jewish Orthodox nationalist activists are working together. among others, to rebuild the temple. Evangelicals are helping Jews to search for the ashes of the red heifer. We need ashes of the red heifer to purify us so that we can enter the Temple Mount. And so far, there aren't yet red heifers. How many of you have seen at least one movie of Indiana Jones? Raise your hand with pride, and don't be embarrassed. Indiana Jones is a real person. Did you know that? He doesn't look like anything of the movies Indiana Jones. Sorry to disappoint people here. The ladies won't jump on him unless they're extremely desperate. But he is a World War II veteran of intelligence and all kinds of amazing deeds. He's also an archaeologist who went out to search for the ashes of the red heifer. Those people work together, have been working together now for a few decades, and something amazing has taken place. This has started as a marriage of convenience. This has started as evangelicals showing interest in Jews who are preparing the ground for the great events of the end times, but criticizing them at the same time for the lack of historical understanding, for the lack of true sense of mission, for their secular culture, for their misreading of the scriptures, you name it. I said, evangelical attitudes towards Jews historically were very mixed. Some of the most virulent elements or moments took place here in Minneapolis, I'm sorry to say. But since the 1980s, we see what I would call warming up. Marriages of convenience can turn into affectionate relationships. That's one of the things we discover when we look at evangelicals and Jews, with real appreciations. You see nationalist Jews, nationalist Orthodox Jews, warming up to evangelical Christians. One and vice versa. Again, two of the, not slides, I'm so old. Two of the illustrations that you don't see are about evangelical Christians volunteering their work for settlers in Judea and Samaria and being hosted in the homes of such settlers, baking bread together. And as my wife pointed out, she couldn't always tell who is the evangelical and who is the Orthodox Jew. This warming up reached a theological level. Very many people paid attention to that. Some Jewish leaders, such as Gershon Solomon, started having revelations of the kind that we expect only among charismatic Christians. Jews sometimes are allowed revelations, they're allowed to encounter Elijah. But he encountered much more than Elijah. Don't tell anyone. On the other hand, a number of influential evangelists have reconsidered the role of the temple and Antichrist. Antichrist was a Jew. Antichrist was in some ways an incarnation, an avatar, if you want to use the term, of the devil. Has ceased being Jewish in some major publications, one of them the Left Behind series. How many of you have read parts or all of the Left Behind series? Again, raise your hands with enormous pride. It's a very readable series, and particularly the first novel already tells you half the story. Antichrist is not Jewish anymore in the novel series. He's a Romanian. Not exactly Roman, but Romanian. He is not Italian in birth, but he's very Italian in character. I don't know what to make up of that. He's Greek Orthodox. So you bypass the old evangelical Catholic disenchantment, and you bypass an insult to the Jews, because the Jews are now reading evangelical tracts. They're talking to evangelicals, saying, what do you mean? We're building the temple and we consider us to be working for Antichrist? Oh, no, 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 no. You will be building the temple that will be perhaps in service of Antichrist for a while, but will survive Antichrist reign and serve this symbolically in the reign of Jesus. Rest assured, we are your friends. We see much less, I would say, in addition to appreciation and historical hopes and messianic hopes, we see much less stereotypical attitude towards Jews among evangelical Christians. We can still hear the occasional Bailey Smith, who was president a while ago of the Southern Baptist Convention, who suddenly declared that God doesn't listen to the prayer of Jews. Or we can occasionally see another person with rather mixed attitudes, the late Jerry Falwell, a great friend of Israel, personal friend of Menachem Begin, who bestowed the Jabotinsky Medal on him, Jabotinsky Order Medal, but who once declared, when he spoke very highly of Jews, but he was using the Jews with the, what I would call economic stereotype of the Jews. He was trying to show you, he was trying to make a claim that you read repeatedly in evangelical literature until the last generation, and this is that Jews are a special nation also in their personal gifts. So he was saying something like, you know, a Jew can make more money accidentally than you can on purpose. I wish. You hear that less and less. There was a survey taken by sociologists from the University of California, Berkeley in the early 1960s on behalf of Nabrith, the Anti-Defamation League of Nabrith at that time. The Anti-Defamation League is not associated anymore with Nabrith. And it cost $500,000 of the early 1960s for those sociologists to discover that Unitarians are less prejudiced against Jews than conservative evangelicals. I would have told them that free of charge. But similar surveys, and they check various stereotypes, various prejudices. By the mid-1980s, they see a huge improvement. Evangelicals, conservative evangelicals are not more prejudiced against Jews than most liberal Protestants or Catholics. What's going on? Evangelicals by the millions visited Israel. Evangelicals by the millions heard lectures about Jews in Israel. Jews have moved, many Jews have moved from certain areas of the countries, mostly the Northeast and Midwest, to what we would call the Sun Belt, and have come to live close to evangelicals and interact with them more. There's a much greater appreciation for Israel and closeness to Israel in the 70s and 80s. By the mid-80s, the surveys already tell us prejudices and stereotypes have decreased enormously. With that thought in mind, I was about to almost finish speaking, except I can't help adding another element that would be particularly controversial, and that is evangelical Jews. The 1970s, this is again post-1967, post the Six-Day War, with a huge improvement of the image of the Jews in American culture in general, and in evangelical circles in particular, and with the increasing emphasis in American culture on roots with the crumbling, eroding of the melting pot paradigm and the creations of new paradigms, of pick and choose, of multi-identities, in a movement of Jewish baby boomers. There have been quite participation among Jews of the baby boom generation in the 60s and 70s in new religious movements, in new spiritual experimentations and explorations. One movement that was particularly controversial came on the scene in the 1970s, a movement of what I would call evangelical Jews, very often known as Jews for Jesus, Jewish believers in Jesus. The popular expression is very often, the self-expression is very often Messianic Jews. Jews for Jesus is just one organization, missionary organization that came about in California in 1970, in the Bay Area, seceded from the old American Board of Missions to the Jews. And that particular group came to challenge all borders, all definitions of what it means to be Jewish, what it means to be Christian, and the borders between the two communities, which was understood until that time to be very firm. If you're Jewish, you're not Christian. If you're Christian, you're not Jewish. But this movement cannot be understood in separation from the entire evangelical Jewish enchantment or ménage, or whatever you'd like to call it. Because it is an outcome of decades of missionary, evangelical missionary work that has come and told Jews have their role in mission in history. The Jewish people need to stay there until the end times, and following the end times, when the Messiah comes, they'll be rehabilitated in the Holy Land, reestablish the kingdom of David, they will become Jesus' right-hand man and women, I'm adding the women, in the Messianic times, in the kingdom of Christ, actually on earth. Missions are using Jewish symbols. They are using Jewish terms. They're telling Jews by becoming Christians in its evangelical forms, you are not betraying your Jewish self, you're just making it more complete. That's what an authentic Jew should become. This doesn't mean you give up or lose your pride in your roots. In the 1970s, a movement of what I would call more powerful, more assertive, more Jewishly assertive evangelical Jews came on the scene. Before the 1970s, there were only a handful of what were known as Hebrew Christian congregations. There have been such attempts made by evangelicals and pietists in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, but we have a number of evangelical communities, most of them Presbyterian, that started in the 1920s and 30s, that are still with us today. 1970s, we get dozens of such groups all around the nation. Jews are at first terribly upset. They don't trust those people. They see them as part of the crazy cults. They relate to them in the same vein that they and the mainstream at large relates to the Hare Krishna, ISKCON, to the Children of God, to Scientology, although those are very different groups, or the Moonists, the Unification Church, and they see Messianic Jews very often as an arm, a missionary arm that is particularly deceitful because those people, instead of telling everybody, we are missionaries, we are Christians, we want you to convert and change your faith, coming and saying, well, actually, we're Jews like you. What could be more misleading than that? But on its own terms, this is an outcome of a long enchantment between evangelicals and Jews and a growing recognition in the evangelical quarters in the Jews and their culture. Such a movement could not have come up or come on in evangelical circles with the same, I would say, conviction and energy a generation or two earlier. It's very much a product of the times, of the culture of the times in general, and of the particular relationship that developed between evangelicals and Jews. And this movement serves in its own, as many Jews don't accept that movement as legitimate, but it serves as a catalyst, an energizer, an interest group within the evangelical framework that demands greater priority, both in evangelizing Jews, but also greater priority in supporting Israel, in standing with Israel, and in taking responsibility financially, politically, for the Israeli experience. At this moment, believe it or not, there are a number of groups, Kufi is just one of them, that are collecting money by the tens of millions each year, some groups, among evangelical Christians for Israeli causes. Some of it is helping bring immigrants to Israel, such as from the former Soviet Union or from Ethiopia, helping settling them in Israel, including in the settlements, but not only, and for an extensive philanthropic work, especially among the elderly, in Israeli society. The International Fellowship of Christian and Jews collects something like $60 million every year for that purpose. It's headed, its leader and founder is an Orthodox rabbi, Yechiel Eckstein, from Chicago originally, but its ranks and file are evangelical Christians. The International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem has been also involved in this kind of philanthropic work, bringing immigrants to Israel and the like. It also works to bring pilgrims, Christian pilgrims from all around the globe to Israel. There are other such groups. Kufi is actually, as I said, a late arrival, but it has certainly entered the arena as a rather large and energetic group. Of course, it's very much a group under a very particular leader who is controversial even among Christian Protestants, but certainly among liberal Jews. To summarize, if I may, evangelical interest in the Jews comes out of a very particular theology, Messianic biblical theology. It comes out of the understanding of evangelicals, who they are, and how they read history, and how they read scriptures. It has been around now for a number of generations. It shows both traditional and revolutionary elements in the relationship of evangelicals and Jews, while liberal Christians, particularly since the 1960s, have amended their traditional theology towards the Jews and come to grant legitimacy to Jews as a sister religion, many of them did. Evangelical attitude is different. Its understanding is we are offering protection and sympathy to the Jews, we're supporting Israel financially and politically, and we are allowing for a Jewish arm, quote unquote, within the evangelical framework, which I would call in some ways an alternative attitude towards the Jews, but which I would claim ultimately is much friendlier than it had been previously. With those thoughts, which I hope are controversial enough to steer questions, discussions, statements, and protests, I will end my talk.